Can't trust the media, they're all full of lies. Once you know a little bit, all hope in you dies. Live free or die. Live free or die. Live free or die. Live free or die. Two-party system, what the hell is that? Votes just the same, nothing but crap. They tell you what to think, they control what you see. Why don't you think and heard it on TV? I said live free or die. 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 Take down the bastards, take them from the rear. Take down the bastards, that is what they fear. Why do you think they limit your rights? Only do that, kill your will to fight and say live free or die. 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 Live free or die.
Welcome to another exciting episode of Hardfire TV Libertarian Issue in Focus on Brooklyn Free Speech Media. I'm your host for today's show. My name is Xiaoxi. Thank you for tuning into Hardfire. Today we have on our show historian and economist Cameron Weber to discuss the debate over the ratification of the U.S. Constitution during the critical period in U.S. history, from the winning of the Revolutionary War until the end of revolution with the Constitution. Cameron, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on the show, Dr. Long, and thank you for your interest in this topic.
Cameron will help us to understand why the Constitution was a step backward in the U.S. project. The U.S. Revolutionary War was fought and won under the Articles of Confederation. Yet, as in so many historical examples, some people take advantage of a revolution to consolidate gains.
Consolidate gains, consolidate power.
Yeah. The American Revolution and the debate over the Constitution as against the more limited government articles of Confederation is an example. First, the U.S. Constitution is sacrosanct, unquestionable for our republic. Why should we question its values?
All right. So today what we're talking about is the critical period in U.S. history, something I've been interested in and studying for the last several months. And this book recently came out that will help us understand what we're talking about. This is Murray Rothbard, Conceived in Liberty, the fifth edition of Rothbard's been dead for 20 years, but they put together, a scholar put together this book from Rothbard's notes, which is the last edition in his history of the founding of the United States. And it's the New Republic, 1784 to 1791. And so that's what we're calling the critical period. So the Revolutionary War was coming to an end and was fought and won under the Articles of Confederation. And then once the Revolutionary War was won, it was decided to get together and relook at the Articles of Confederation to establish the new republic now that the Revolutionary War was won. And what happened, instead of revising the Articles of Confederation, what happened is the Federalists, those who wanted a larger central government, a larger federal government, as opposed to the Antifederalists, who were against reestablishing a strong central government, like against the English. The Revolutionary War, the Anti-Federalists didn't want to reestablish a large central power because that's what they fought against in the war. So you had the Federalists who used the Articles of Confederation to actually create a new constitution at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, instead of revising the Articles of Confederation under which the Revolutionary War was won. The Federalists were able to create a constitution, and that constitution, as we'll be discovering, gave a lot of power to the central state that has caused us problems over the years.
So how do we begin to...
And the winners write the history. So we all know of the Federalist Papers, and many historians look at the signing and the ratification of the Constitution as a successful endeavor in American history, in the American project. But Rothbard and other anti-federalists, like myself, say that no, the Constitution is a step backward in American liberty. The argument is not, did the South win over the North, or did those living along the eastern seaboard and slave owners win over those who were small farmers living in the West? It's really about power versus liberty, and power won. The Constitution, the Federalists won over liberty. The Anti-Federalists wanted to prioritize individual rights and liberty and states' rights. The Articles of Confederation, again, under which the Revolutionary War was won, it was a common defense document. You had 13 individual states who had their own rights to internal policies, and the Articles of Confederation was simply a way to defend those 13 individual states. And then with the Federalists and the Constitution, the states lost their power due to a large central state being created. Yeah. So we are questioning the underlying historical memory and values of the Republic. And our argument is that the United States would have been better under the Articles of Confederation. Had the Anti-Federalists won against the Federalists, the nation would have been a better nation. Yeah.
So how do we begin to understand the Federalists versus Anti-Federalists debate during this
Yes. Right. So many historians look at factions. Okay, first of all, the historical memory is that the United States project was one of ideology, one of the rights of man and the Enlightenment, and against taxation without representation and overthrowing the English Empire. And that's the historical memory. But in fact, what you had going on, you had the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists, and we have a graphic on that. Why don't we look at that? So the Federalists, they wanted the new Constitution. They wanted to illegally usurp the Articles of Confederation, which were supposed to be in perpetuity. And then the Anti-Federalists, they were against the Constitution. And the Federalists were large farmers and slaveholders, wealthy city merchants in England and New York. And they wanted to use they wanted a federal central state to have the right to create trade policy, because they wanted to put trade barriers against English imports to protect the wealthy New England and New York manufacturers from competition. And so the Anti-Federalists didn't want that central power trade policy because they thought it was unfair to protect those manufacturers from foreign competition. The Federalists also wanted a stronger state and a standing army, which is a big thing the Anti-Federalists didn't want. I mean, look, we've been in Afghanistan for 17 years. Talk about a standing army, right? And so the Federalists were also the Anti-Federalists called the military leaders, the Federalist leaders, armchair generals, because the Anti-Federalists were actually the militia who the Anti-Federalists believed their militia guerrilla tactics won the Revolutionary War, not the standing army. And then the Anti-Federalists were small farmers away from the coast, so they didn't want the protectionism for the manufacturers along the coast and the navigational acts like the English Empire. They wanted something different, not power but liberty. And the Anti-Federalists had a clear majority in several states. But as we'll find out, the Federalists used certain tactics to ensure that the Constitution was ratified. Right, and so the main Federalists then, from the Federalist Papers, the main Federalists were Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay, and then George Washington was also a Federalist and the first president. And then on the Anti-Federalists, their leaders weren't as strong and they weren't as organized. You had Patrick Henry in Virginia, George Mason in Virginia, James Monroe, I think he was in New York, and then Luther Martin, I'm not sure where he was. And then also George Clinton in New York, the governor of New York. He was a strong Anti-Federalist. And then on the fence, you had Thomas Jefferson. So a lot of historians look at the argument over what form the new American state would take as Jeffersonians versus Hamiltonians. But that's really not a correct lens, because Jefferson was in Paris at the time during this debate over the Constitution. And then John Hancock was also on the fence, and he, of course, signed the Declaration of, he also signed the Constitution, right? So you had, right, so that's the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists.
So who exactly then were the Anti-Federalists against the creation of this new Constitution?
Right. First, I think we should say that the whole idea of Federalist versus Anti-Federalist is a misnomer. The Federalists took this name, the Federalists, and when we think of federalism, we think of a separation of power between local government and federal government, where the states have rights, but in fact, those calling themselves Federalists were central government people, statists, Hamiltonians. They were not Federalists. They were statists, central statists. But The main reasons the Anti-Federalists were against the Constitution is because the main reason was it gave the new federal government the right to tax. And they thought that that power to tax would then build up a large power for the central government, destroying states' rights and individual liberties. And that is indeed what has happened. The American Revolution was funded. Each state raised their own militia and raised their own funds and put it towards the common defense. And, for example, Patrick Henry said, no, we don't want a federal government with the power to tax. We won the Revolutionary War under the Articles of Confederation. Let's just have the states raise funds and militia and not have a standing army. And because that's how the Revolutionary War was won. And again, in many states, the Anti-Federalists against the Constitution had the majority. Right, so we already talked about the Anti-Federalists were against the ability for the central government to have a standing army. Again, because it thought it would recreate an empire like the British Empire they had just fought against. And then we also talked about trade policy. The Anti-Federalists were against monopolizing trade power with the central government. And the Anti-Federalists were against giving the central government a monopoly on monetary policy. Especially, they were wary of Alexander Hamilton's central bank, a central bank where the federal government would channel money towards their crony special interests, which is exactly what we have today with the great 2007-2008 bailouts, where you had both the Democrats and the Republicans funneling bailout money to their cronies. And one of and I'm not exactly sure who said this, but one of the philosophies behind the Anti-Federalists was that the Constitution would turn patriots into partisans. And that's exactly what we have today. We have a two-party partisan system where the politicians are more concerned about appeasing their party and working their way up in the party as opposed to representing their constituents locally as a matter of principle. They're more just partisans. And then the Anti-Federalists were also against the 3/5 clause giving slaveholders in the South special voting rights. So slaveholders in the South had 1.6 votes due to the 3/5 clause, and so the Anti-Federalists were against that as well, against the continuation of slavery in the Constitution. And so basically the trade-off that occurred was the North got their navigational acts and their ability to put on trade barriers, and the South got their 3/5 slave clause, and that was power versus liberty. So the Anti-Federalists lost the process of creating the Constitution, and then they also lost their fight against the ratification of the Constitution.
Mary Rothbard finds that the Federalists used superlegal means by which to ensure that the Constitution would be successful. Right. Can you give examples of these findings?
Right. So a lot of my work and understanding of the critical period was based, again, on this Murray Rothbard book. And Rothbard uses a lens in his historiography, again, of power versus liberty, not versus North-South or Hamilton versus Jefferson, but power versus liberty, or Federalists versus Anti-Federalists. And he finds that the Federalists used certain tactics to ensure that the states would ratify the Constitution. So the Federalists, again, were the wealthy merchants and traders in the North and the South, and then the big slaveholders in the South, and they controlled the media, the newspapers. So the Federalist papers, or the arguments for the Constitution, appeared much more often in the mainstream press than did the Anti-Federalist arguments against the Constitution. So the media control was one way the Federalists won against the Anti-Federalists during the debate over the Constitution. The other way is, and this is the study of bureaucracy, is the Federalists also controlled the U.S. mail, right? So correspondence between the Federalists would go through the mails no problem, but correspondence between the Anti-Federalists was often slowed up intentionally by the Federalists. For example, at the end of the ratification process, before New York and Virginia ratified, you had Anti-Federalists in New York and Virginia who were working together to prevent the New York and Virginia from ratifying the Constitution, because if New York and Virginia wouldn't ratify the Constitution, well, then you wouldn't have a usurpation of the Articles of Confederation, because those were two of the largest, most powerful states, especially Virginia. So the suppression in the media and the suppression through the mails was one tactic that the Federalists used against the Anti-Federalists. Another was a manipulation of the apportionment process during the states' ratification conventions, where the Federalists ensured that votes in the state constitution for ratification of the Constitution, votes were given more geographically towards where Federalists were. So by manipulating the voting, we'd call it gerrymandering today, by manipulating who votes, they ensured that there was more Federalists voting at the state level for the Constitution against the Anti-Federalists. And I should say that about Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry's well known for saying, "Give me liberty or give me death," right? "Give me liberty or give me death." There's a big statue of Patrick Henry in Richmond, Virginia. Every time I go down there, I visit the Patrick Henry statue. But he was nominated to represent Virginia at the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention, which was supposed to revise the original Articles of Confederation. But he refused to attend the Constitutional Convention because he said, "I smell a rat." "I smell a rat," is what Patrick Henry said. He knew that the Federalists were creating a new constitution for power to have a enlarged federal state with especially an enlarged executive branch, right? Like reinstating the king or something like that is what the Anti-Federalists were worried about. And if you look at the war powers that the president has had in the 20th and 21st century, well, their predictions came true. Okay, so another way that the Federalists ensured ratification by the states is by wealthy Federalists would say, if you don't ratify the Constitution, well, then we'll secede. In other words, we won't be part of the new union. Okay. Another way is, especially, and this was the case with John Hancock, who was an Anti-Federalist, but the Federalists promised Anti-Federalists that if you help us ratify the Constitution, we'll help you or guarantee you a position in the new federal government. And so if you go against the wishes of your constituents, your Anti-Federalist constituents who elected you to represent them at the ratification assemblies, if you ratify the Constitution, then we'll give you a seat in the new government. So that was another tactic that the Federalists did to ensure ratification. Yep. Oh, yeah. One other thing is that, which I think is pretty ironic and funny, is that the Federalists say, well, if you don't allow the federal government to have monopoly over trade policy, in other words, if you don't allow us to put trade barriers against English goods, well, then you're a Tory or you're pro-Britain, and you're not really a real American revolutionary. Mm-hmm. So these were the tactics that the Federalists used.
Okay. So in the end, the Federalists get their constitution, and therefore the process is seen as a succeed.
Right. It's seen that the Constitution, the signing of the Constitution, was a success in American history. Yeah.
Yeah. So can you tell us why the Constitution has been a failure?
Why the Constitution's been a failure?
Yeah.
Well, we've got a graphic for that. Yeah. Why the Constitution is harmful through today. Well, the government had power, or the size of the government in the economy just keeps getting larger and larger and larger. In other words, the coercive state is overcoming voluntary human interaction, right? Is an example of what the Antifederalists were worried about. And then we've also had endless wars, which is again what the Antifederalists were concerned about in terms of a standing army and the ability to tax. Yeah. And we also have a debasement of our currency through the central bank and running up debt, passing on debt to children yet born, and certainly not voting. All of this stuff that the federal government is up to, the Anti-Federalists warned us about 240 years ago, right? We're in 2016, it'll be the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So we're studying American history in honor of our 250th anniversary. And another big problem with the Constitution, as opposed to the original Articles of Confederation, is the corrupt behavior that Congress has turned over a lot of power to the executive branch, and so you have a president who pretty much does whatever they want to do. Yeah, a lot of discretionary power, right? If you give discretionary power over foreign aid, well then of course a president's going to abuse that for political reasons.
Thank you, Cameron.
You're welcome.
Yeah. And thank you for watching Hardfire TV on Brooklyn Free Speech Media, courtesy of the Brick Arts Media House in downtown Brooklyn. If you like this show, you may like our Hardfire TV show called The Problem with Macroeconomics. You can find this and more than 100 other Hardfire shows on YouTube. Thank you for watching Hardfire TV. We'll see you next time.